The room felt impossibly still. Not a single word was spoken, yet the air vibrated with judgment, whispers, and the kind of quiet cruelty that makes you feel naked, even when fully clothed. She stood near the entrance, clutching a worn suitcase, the leather strap digging into her palm as if it were trying to anchor her in place. Her knuckles turned white, and she had to swallow hard to keep her trembling from betraying her. Her eyes stayed locked on the polished wooden floor, tracing the grain like it could offer some invisible protection. She was supposed to be stepping into a new life, a new chance. Instead, she felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her, silently declaring she did not belong. The matchmaker, a petite woman with sharp spectacles perched at the tip of her nose, cleared her throat, a sound that made her heart jump. "Next," she said. Her voice was brisk, professional, but lacked any warmth. It was a signal to the room that the performance, the cruel evaluation of her very being, was about to continue. The men, seated in neat rows, had spent the morning flipping through pages of profiles, scanning pictures and biographies as though choosing groceries. There had been nods of approval, quiet chuckles of interest, even the occasional low whistle for some of the women, but when her profile came up, the room's energy shifted like a sudden winter wind. Chairs creaked, bodies leaned back uncomfortably, brows furrowed. One man's laugh was low and cruel, muffled into his hand as if even he recognized how small and cruel it was. "Not my type," someone muttered, barely lifting his gaze from the table. "She's too dark." Another whispered, loud enough that it cut across the silence like a blade. And with those words, she felt her body shrink. Her chest tightened, her stomach churned. It was a phrase she had feared. A phrase she had imagined, but never thought she would have to hear in a room so full of people who could decide her future. The word dark felt heavier than any suitcase she had carried across oceans. She sensed every glance, every judgmental stare that fell upon her like raindrops in a storm. Pity from a few, averted eyes from others, laughter from some. She could feel it all seeping into her bones. She had crossed oceans, believing in a promise older than herself. That character mattered more than color, that dignity and resilience would outweigh prejudice. Yet in this hall, under the cold fluorescent lights, surrounded by the whispered cruelties of strangers, those promises seemed like lies. She was a stranger in a place that expected her to perform for approval. And now she stood rejected, almost erased, like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. The matchmaker fumbled through her papers, clearly anxious to move past the awkwardness, to turn the room's attention elsewhere and pretend this moment had not happened. Her name was barely mentioned, spoken quickly and with an almost dismissive shrug. It was as if her very existence in that space was a mistake, a blemish on the polished routine of this matchmaking parade. She took a shaky breath and gripped her suitcase tighter, feeling as if it were the only thing in the world that acknowledged her right to stand there. Then the door creaked. The sound was small, barely noticeable, yet it cut through the room like a bell. Heads turned instinctively, curious at the interruption. A man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying an air of quiet authority that didn't need announcement. His clothes were simple, well-worn denim, a button-up shirt, boots with traces of dust, but his posture, the way he held himself, radiated something more. Confidence, experience, the kind of strength that didn't rely on display. He smelled faintly of earth and hay, as if he had just walked out of the fields, away from the machinery and the soil. Yet there was a subtle richness to him that spoke of wealth earned through patience and hard work. He was a millionaire farmer, though no one would have guessed it from his modest appearance. And in that moment, he paused, his gaze landing squarely on her, her eyes, still glued to the floor. Felt the weight of his attention before she dared to meet it. When she finally lifted her head, their eyes locked, and for a heartbeat, the chaos of the room seemed to vanish. The whispered judgments, the shuffling of papers, the polite coughs, they all melted into silence. In his eyes, she did not see the same scrutiny, the same dismissive judgment. He did not see skin, did not see color. He saw her posture, the quiet strength that she carried despite every cruel word thrown her way. He saw the dignity she refused to let go of, the resilience wrapped around her like armor, and for the first time that morning, she felt seen, truly seen, not as a page in a book to be judged and discarded, but as a person. The room shifted uneasily, sensing the change before understanding it. The men who had laughed, the ones who had whispered, the ones who had barely looked, all of them paused, confused by this late arrival who seemed to alter the atmosphere simply by noticing her. Sim frowned. Sim leaned forward, curious. Others tried to hide it, the realization that perhaps they had been wrong in their assessments, that maybe their measures of beauty and worth were flawed. The matchmaker's hand twitched slightly, a pen poised in midair as she realized the narrative was slipping from her control. This was no longer a straightforward selection. This was no longer a room filled with condescending appraisals. The energy had shifted, and it began at the point where his eyes met hers. For a moment, the black male Lord Bride allowed herself to breathe. Just a fraction, a sliver of hope. It was dangerous, fragile, but it was there. And the man, the millionaire, Pharma, gave the faintest nod, a small acknowledgement that she mattered in a way none of these other people had ever considered. It was not pity, it was not performance. It was recognition, and it sent a ripple of tension through the room, a subtle tremor that made everyone aware that something unexpected was happening. She straightened subtly at first, but then with a growing resolve. Her chin lifted, her shoulders squared. Each breath became more certain. She could feel ethos shift in power, the subtle challenge to those who had dismissed her so easily. She was no longer just a candidate to be judged. She was someone whose presence could command attention, whose worth could not be measured by shallow prejudice. The men exchanged uneasy glances, whispers starting up again, but this time, with uncertainty, the laughter had vanished. The dismissive words had stopped. The contrast between their superficial judgments and his deliberate, considered gaze created a tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. And in that moment, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She felt the possibility of a story that didn't begin with rejection, but with recognition. A story where dignity mattered more than color, where strength mattered more than surface appearances, and where a single choice could defy the expectations of everyone in the room. Their eyes remained locked, speaking a language neither needed to voice. She understood that he had seen her, all of her, and in that recognition lay the first turn in a narrative no one in that hall could have predicted. And for a heartbeat, she allowed herself to imagine a future that was no longer dictated by whispers, by judgment, by shallow prejudice. The door closed softly behind him, sealing the space around them, in a moment suspended between despair and a possibility. The matchmaker cleared her throat again, trying to regain control, but it was futile. The momentum had shifted. The narrative had begun to bend in a way no one had foreseen, and everyone in the room could feel it. Something was coming. Something that would challenge expectations, shatter preconceptions, and perhaps, in a way no one could yet name, transform lives. She stood there, suitcase in hand, eyes steady, heart trembling but ready. And as the millionaire farmer took a step closer, the room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In that silent, electric moment, it was clear this was no longer just a selection. This was the start of a story no one would forget. The room shifted uneasily, as if it sensed a change it didn't like. The air, once filled with polite murmurs and the soft scratch of pens on paper, became taut, charged. Someone leaned toward the millionaire farmer and whispered, low enough to sting if he listened, "She's still available. For a reason." The words were coated in warning, a thin veil of "don't waste your time," as if the very act of noticing her was a misstep. Another added, "You won't want trouble on your farm." The caution was clear. They expected him to conform, to see her the way they did as a problem, an afterthought, an anomaly. The matchmaker herself smiled tightly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, that carries a silent calculation. She had already prepared to redirect his attention, to nudge him toward someone deemed more acceptable, someone whose color or features conformed to the invisible rules of this room. But the farmer didn't move. His gaze stayed locked on her, not a glance, not a passing interest, but a steady, deliberate look that made the whispers seem shallow, hollow. And in that look, she felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. She felt truly seen. Not measured, not weighed, not inspected, not judged, but noticed. Not for her color, not for her profile, not for the superficial assessments of strangers, but for herself. And yet, hope was a dangerous thing. She had allowed it once that morning, and it had failed her. Hope had left her exposed, trembling, nearly humiliated in front of everyone. She did not dare welcome it again. Not fully. Still, the injustice of the room surrounded her like a tightening rope. Each time someone praised another bride, it felt like another lash across her chest. Their faces were studied, their smiles dissected, their futures spoken of as investments, as careful projects that could be refined and perfected. Meanwhile, she remained a shadow at the edge, a presence everyone wished would disappear quietly, like dust slipping off a polished surface. A man scoffed loudly, turning his chair just enough for her to hear. "You don't want trouble on your farm?" Another muttered, "She won't fit in." Each word sank into her chest like stones, each a reminder of her supposed place in this world. The whispers, the warnings, the low judgments, they weren't directed at her in this moment, but the air carried them all the same. Yet, the farmer did not flinch. He did not blink. He did not waver. For a heartbeat, time seemed to hold itself, in balance. Then, calm but deliberate, he asked the one question that no one else had bothered to ask all day. What's her name? The room froze. Papers stopped, shuffling. Pens hovered mid-air. Conversations died in mid-word. The question should have been simple, basic, polite, but it carried a weight that made everyone uncomfortable. No one had bothered to ask her name before. She was a body, a profile, a category to be judged and dismissed. And now, suddenly, she was human again. Her lips parted softly, voiced barely above a whisper at first. Amara, she said. The sound of her name was steady, measured, but it carried something that no one expected: years of endurance, survival, and quiet pride. In that single word, there was the memory of rejection, the invisible bruises of a life learned in silence. The dignity of someone who had been overlooked too many times to count. The farmer nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Amara, he repeated, letting the name linger in the air as if tasting it. What do you do? Tell me about yourself. And so, she spoke. Not with pleading. Not with desperation. Not with rehearsed lines designed to appease. She spoke truthfully. She spoke of the skills she had honed over years of labor, of cooking, of tending, of managing life with quiet efficiency. She spoke of her work ethic, how she rose before dawn, how she persevered when no one watched. She spoke of her faith in building a family, in nurturing, in creating a life from care and commitment. Her voice was soft but unwavering, a quiet force that carried more weight than the judgments that had been hurled at her that morning. And in the telling, she unsettled the room far more than desperation ever could have. There was no panic in her tone, no shame, no apology. There was only truth. And truth, when spoken calmly, carries its own kind of power. The other men shifted in their seats. The matchmaker pressed her lips together in a thin line, and the whispers swelled. Questions of reputation, appearance, and social expectations circulated again. Louder this time, more insistent. Are you? Sure. It's unusual. Risque. You know what others will say? She doesn't fit the image. They were warnings, disguised as concern, threats masked as advice. They tried to pull him back, to bend his attention to their will. But the farmer, the millionaire farmer, listened. Really listened. Every word she spoke, every subtle pause, every line of strength wrapped into her soft tones. He absorbed it, and then, something remarkable happened. He smiled, not a faint, polite smile. Not the kind that acknowledges a social expectation or a rule. A genuine, quiet, knowing smile. The kind of smile that shifts the energy of a room, that makes the critics pause, that makes the whispered judgments falter. The room felt it immediately. The tightness in the air loosened, almost imperceptibly, but enough to register. Whispers faltered mid-sentence. Frowns appeared, then disappeared. The cautious, condescending calculations of everyone present were rendered meaningless by the simple act of recognition. He had made his choice. His attention, his approval, his respect were hers, and no one else's opinion mattered. She felt it, too. The subtle shift in her chest, the weight of fear giving way to something new, something delicate and fragile but real. The smile was not an end. It was a beginning. A promise that her worth was not dictated by the room, by prejudice, or by whispers behind her back. Her dignity had not been broken, not by their words, not by their judgment. And now, for the first time that day, she felt a spark of hope ignite, quiet but undeniable. In the center of her chest, the matchmaker's fingers twitched, a pen hovering nervously above a blank sheet. She had attempted to control the narrative, to dictate who should be considered, who should be overlooked. Yet here, in the presence of someone willing to look past the shallow assessments of the crowd, she was powerless. The room's unspoken rules had been broken. The expectations, the invisible hierarchy. The careful choreography of approval, all of it dissolved in the face of something she could not manipulate. Truth, resilience, and recognition. The whispers continued, but now with tension instead of certainty. The room was divided, the power structure subtly shifting in real time. No one knew what to do with the farmer who saw her, really saw her, for herself. And Amara, the black mail-order bride, who had been nearly erased that morning, felt something she had not felt in years. She mattered. She was visible. She was valid. And for the first time in this long, painful day, she could imagine herself not as an object of scrutiny, but as a person who could be chosen, who could be recognized, who could be valued for the fullness of who she was. The farmer's calm persistence, his quiet insistence, his refusal to be swayed by gossip or appearances, created a tension in the room so thick it could have been felt physically. And yet, it was beautiful in its own way. Tension, that carried possibility, that promised a reversal of expectations. In his smile, there was a challenge to every judgment. a quiet defiance against prejudice, and an affirmation that integrity and dignity could still be recognized in a world that often refused to see them. She allowed herself a slow breath, steadying her hands, straightening her posture just slightly. She didn't yet know what would happen next. She didn't yet know if hope would flourish or falter. But she knew one thing. She had been noticed, and in noticing lay the beginning of a transformation, not just for her, but for everyone in the room who thought they had the right to define her worth. And as the whispers swirled, the warnings continued, and the matchmaker's tight smile remained. The farmer's gaze stayed steady. His smile widened just slightly, warm, unshakable, and entirely unexpected. In that moment, the room understood, even if only silently, that the story was no longer theirs to control. Something was coming. Something that would defy expectation. Something that would change the trajectory of lives in ways no one had anticipated. And Amara, standing tall, despite the lingering sting of judgment, felt the first real warmth of possibility. She could not yet speak it aloud, could not yet name it in full, but she sensed it deep inside her. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. He walked toward her. Every step he took seemed to echo louder than the murmurs in the room, louder than the whispers of judgment that had filled the air all morning. Chairs creaked under shifting weight. A cough broke somewhere in the back, tentative and awkward. But none of it mattered. All that mattered was the space between them, the distance that had separated possibility from rejection, recognition from dismissal. Each footfall of the millionaire farmer was deliberate, calm, certain. It was as if he alone held the rhythm of the room, and everyone else had become a background blur. She felt her heart beat in her throat, fast enough she feared it would give her away, but steady enough to remind her she was still standing. She had learned long ago that standing itself was a defiance, that holding one's posture in the face of judgment was a small victory. But now, something bigger was about to happen, something she had never dared imagine. The room seemed to shrink, compressing around the intensity of the moment. Men who had spoken casually, who had whispered cruel judgments, now leaned forward, in silent anticipation, unsure if they were witnesses or participants. The matchmaker's fingers twitched nervously over her clipboard, but she didn't speak. The farmer's focus was unbroken. His eyes never left hers, and she felt, deep inside, the weight of being truly seen. It was not the shallow recognition of beauty, nor the polite acknowledgement of politeness. It was the gaze of someone who understood value, not the superficial kind dictated by skin, or color, or social expectation, but the kind forged through resilience, through integrity, through quiet strength. He stopped in front of her, so close that she could feel the faint scent of earth clinging to his shirt, the subtle warmth of his presence, the grounded confidence that had seemed to ripple through the room. And then, he spoke, low, calm, deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. Do you want a life built on respect? His words were simple, direct, but they carried the weight of choice, of possibility, of a future that she had never allowed herself to imagine. Her throat tightened. Tears burned behind her eyes, threatening to spill, threatening to betray the combination of relief, hope, and disbelief that coursed through her. She nodded, barely, but enough. That was all she had ever wanted, respect. Nothing more. Nothing. The room, already tense, seemed to hold its collective breath. Nobody moved. Nobody dared speak. It was as if every expectation, every carefully rehearsed prejudice, had paused, uncertain how to proceed. And then, the farmer turned to face them, the audience that had once dictated her worth. He raised his voice, calm but unwavering, clear and unapologetic. I'm not looking for decoration, he said. His tone left no room for misinterpretation. I'm looking for partnership. Someone strong enough to stand through storms. Someone who has known hardship and still chooses kindness. Someone who carries dignity even when it's not acknowledged. The words hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Faces stiffened. Eyebrows rose. Some mouths fell open, caught in a combination of surprise and incredulity. Others flushed with embarrassment, realizing that their whispered judgments, their casual dismissals, had been shallow, superficial, and cruel. Some scowled, angry that the power they thought they held, the power to approve or dismiss, had been flipped in a single, decisive moment. And then, finally, the words came that would forever change the rhythm of the room. Words that stunned, silenced, and reshaped the space entirely. I choose her. The gasps rippled like waves, knocking against the walls and bouncing through the hall. Men shifted uneasily in their seats. A few tried to pretend it hadn't happened, clearing throats or adjusting papers. But the impact was undeniable. Some looked away, ashamed. Some tightened their fists, simmering with indignation. And a few, who had whispered cruelly just moments ago, suddenly understood what their prejudice had cost them, not in dollars or influence, but in human decency, In the beauty of seeing someone for who they truly were, rather than who they appeared to be on paper, the room's power dynamic flipped in seconds. Those who had expected to wield control, to dictate outcomes, now found themselves powerless. The authority that had seemed so clear, the judgments, the whispers, the subtle cores dissolved in the presence of integrity and choice. The farmer, by simply deciding with clarity and purpose, had reminded everyone what true power looked like. It was not measured in whispers, in approvals, in whom one dismissed or accepted. True power, he demonstrated, came from knowing one's own values, acting on them, and refusing to be swayed by the shallow currents of prejudice. And then came the deeper revelation, the kind that made the gasps turn into silent awe. They had underestimated him. They had assumed a farmer, someone grounded in labor and simplicity, could not be a figure of wealth and influence. And yet, the truth was undeniable. He owned thousands of acres. He employed half the county. Quietly, without show or proclamation, he funded schools, shelters, and opportunities for those the world often forgot. A millionaire, yes, but one who did not need the approval of anyone. One who acted on principle, not pretense. One who sought worth where others only saw color. As for her, Amara, the woman they had dismissed, the woman they had assumed was beneath, noted she felt something she had never felt in that room before. She stood taller, shoulders firm, spine straight. Not because she had been chosen, but because she had never lost herself. Every moment of endurance, every quiet struggle, every unacknowledged act of dignity had led to this point. Her worth had never been in question, though others had tried to convince her it was. And now, finally, recognition had arrived in the purest form, not pity, not obligation, not social expectation, but deliberate, conscious choice. The beauty of it was quiet. It was not loud, not boastful, not performative. It did not require applause, but it carried the full weight of moral triumph. Dignity, finally, had one, completely. No one in the room could ignore it. The whispers of judgment, the sneers of disapproval, the shallow expectations, all had been rendered meaningless. Integrity and character, quiet strength and enduring kindness, had prevailed. And in that, a lesson spread, subtle but undeniable. The world may try to define your worth, may try to measure you against shallow standards, but dignity, when preserved, has a power far greater than prejudice, far greater than wealth, far greater than expectation. Amara felt her chest rise and fall with steady breaths. Tears still lingering at the corners of her eyes, but not of sorrow. They were the tears of release, of validation, of survival, finally meeting recognition. She did not speak. She did not have to. Her posture, her quiet strength, her calm presence said everything. She had endured, she had survived, and now she was honored not as a reward for submission, not for pleasing others, but for simply being herself. The farmer extended a hand, not in condescension, but as an invitation, an equal, a partnership, as he had said, and she took it, not timidly, not hesitantly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had already endured more than most could imagine. The hall remained still, everyone frozen between shock, awe, and grudging respect. And in that stillness, a truth was written more clearly than any contract, more clearly than any social expectation. True worth cannot be denied. True dignity cannot be crushed. And the courage to stand for oneself is a force that changes everything. For the first time that day, the room understood a reality it had refused to see. Choice matters. Integrity matters. Recognition matters. Recognition matters. And those who judge without seeing, who dismiss without understanding, ultimately reveal more about themselves than they do about the one they try to measure. And so, in that quiet, profound moment, the story shifted. The woman who had been dismissed, overlooked, almost erased, stood with her head high, not because she had been elevated, but because she had never fallen. The farmer, steady and resolute, had made a choice that honored human dignity. And the lesson lingered, soft but powerful. Respect, partnership, and recognition are far more valuable than appearances, prejudice, or shallow social expectation. In this moment, dignity did not just survive, triumphed, completely and The morning sun spilled softly over the fields, casting long, golden shadows across the farmhouse. There were no crowds, no grand decorations, no curious eyes pressed into every detail. The wedding was small, intentional, honest. It was not a performance for approval, nor a display to soothe the whispers. It was simply to people, two souls who had survived, endured, and chosen each other without shame, stepping into a shared life. The air smelled faintly of hay, earth, and wildflowers. The quiet was almost sacred, holding a sense of promise that no applause could ever match. There was a simple altar of worn wood, a few chairs arranged in gentle arcs, and a handful of witnesses, who had seen enough life to understand the weight of the moment. And in that gentle hush, the black bride, Amara, felt the full depth of what it meant to be seen not for her color, not for her profile, not for anyone's shallow acceptations, but for the fullness of who she was. Her dress was simple, flowing, made not for spectacle, but for comfort and movement. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the enormity of the day, from the quiet triumph of being here, fully acknowledged, fully chosen. Around her, the millionaire farmer tall.com and steady weighted his presence carried the same strength it had on that first day, but now it was softened, warmed by respect, admiration, and the kind of quiet love that grows from understanding and shared struggle. They exchanged glances, a conversation without words, each acknowledging the journey they had endured. Every slight, every whispered judgment from the past, every skeptical glance that had followed them now seemed distant, almost unreal. They had arrived here by being themselves, and that alone made this day extraordinary. Life on the farm was never the same after that morning. Each day became an exercise in quiet transformation, in learning the rhythm of shared lives. Amara brought warmth to corners of the farmhouse that had long been cold. She filled rooms with laughter, stories, and a steady presence that softened the hard edges of days carved by toil. Her hands calloused from years of labor and resilience moved through the kitchen, the garden, and the barn with a purpose that reminded everyone that survival had built more than strength, it had built wisdom. Even the simplest acts, like tending to the animals or repairing a fence, became lessons in care, patience, and dignity. The farmer changed too, though not because he had been corrected by anyone. He changed because he had been awakened. He saw, in Amara, the quiet truth he had always known but rarely witnessed in such clarity. That the world often mistook appearance for value, that dignity could be so easily denied, and that standing against that current required courage, not performative approval. He had lived among people who measured worth in shallow terms, who decided futures based on color or family names. But now, watching Amara, he understood something deeper, the power of seeing value where others refused to look, the strength in choosing integrity over conformity, the joy of honoring character above expectation. The small farm became a sanctuary, not just for them, but for those who witnessed their bond. Neighbors who had once whispered in judgment found themselves pausing, watching quietly. Children in the community saw something different now, a model of partnership built on respect, a lesson that strength and kindness were not mutually exclusive. The whispers faded, replaced by a reluctant admiration that grew slowly, like the shoots of spring breaking through hardened earth. And for Amara and the farmer, that quiet shift mattered less than the world's approval. It mattered that they had chosen each other fully, with eyes open, hearts honest, and hands steady. Seasons passed. Winters were met with shared labor and long evenings by the fire. Summers brought laughter in the fields, mornings filled with light, and evenings that smelled of hay and honeysuckle. Amara's warmth softened days that had once been heavy. Her wisdom, shaped by years of navigating a world that had dismissed her, guided decisions both large and small. The farm thrived not because of wealth alone, but because of the harmony that grew from mutual respect and shared vision. The farmer's leadership became gentler, informed not just by experience but by the example Amara set every day. They were partners in the truest sense, each bringing what the other lacked, each filling spaces the other could not. People spoke of their marriage years later with awe, not because it had been unexpected, though some had whispered that a black Millionaire bride could never truly be accepted in such circles, but because it had been right. Every small act, every quiet gesture, every smile and word carried the weight of authenticity. She had never been a consolation choice. She had never been a secondary option. She had been perfect, and they both knew it. And the world, slowly, learned it too. There were moments that reminded the community of the magnitude of what had occurred. A neighbor would remark, quietly, on how she managed the animals with such patience. Another would note how she could calm even the most fractious children, or soothe a storm-tossed horse with steady hands and steady voice. And the farmer, always observing, always learning, never failed to acknowledge her impact, not for show, but in the quiet exchange of gratitude and respect that defined their partnership. Every action spoke louder than words. Their life together was proof that respect and worth are cultivated, nurtured, and protected by those willing to see beyond shallow measures. And yet, the lesson lingered far beyond the farm. Worth is not assigned by the crowd. Character is not measured by color. The choice to honor someone fully, to recognize dignity where others overlook it, has consequences that ripple far beyond the individual. Some choices don't just change a life, they expose the truth about everyone watching. The ones who judged, the ones who whispered, the ones who laughed in ignorance, all of them were reminded that the superficial assessments of the world often conceal blindness, and that courage lies in seeing clearly, in acting decisively. And in valuing what others disregard, Amara stood beside her husband in the fields. Sunlight falling across her face, warmth seeping into her bones. She did not need validation from the whispers of others. She had endured. She had survived. She had been chosen not because of someone else's expectation, but because of who she was. And that, more than any wealth, more than any applause, more than any grand gesture, had made her triumphant. The farmer, observing her, smiled. He did not need to justify his choice. He did not seek applause. He only needed to see and to act. And in his choice, the moral of the story was clear to anyone patient enough to observe. Integrity, dignity, and the courage to choose rightly. No matter the noise around you, create lives that are meaningful, honorable, and unassailable. The quiet wedding, the simple farm, the days filled with labor and laughter, the mutual respect and understanding, these were the victories, not the money, not the approval of those who whispered, not the social validation. These were the markers of true triumph. And through it all, Amara and the farmer proved something eternal. That love, choice, and respect, when aligned with character, cannot be undermined. They cannot be dismissed. They cannot be measured by the shallow standards of a judgmental world. She was never a consolation. She was never second best. She was perfect. And together, they built a life that reminded everyone who watched that worth cannot be dictated by the crowd. That character matters above color, and that the right person sees value where others refuse to look. And in that truth, the story endured. Not loudly, not with spectacle, but completely. Years later, when people spoke of their marriage, it was with reverence, and a quiet understanding. Not because it was improbable, not because it was scandalous, but because it was right. And in their union, in the small, intentional choices of every day, the world was reminded, respect, dignity, and integrity are not gifts to be earned from others. They are foundations to be recognized, honored, and lived. And those who refuse to see them reveal not the absence of worth in others, but the blindness in themselves.